Welcome to Dispatches, the official podcast for the Journal of the American Revolution. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Dispatches. I'm your host, Brady Kreitzer. Today, our guest is archaeologist Jonathan Burns, and he's working on a long-forgotten site of the early 18th century in the life of George Washington. In October of 1758, George Washington accidentally engaged in a firefight in the wilds of western Pennsylvania against his own men. This is known as the Friendly Fire Incident. For many years, this site was thought to be lost, but because of his work, archaeologist Jonathan Burns believes he's found it. Jonathan Burns, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Brady. I really appreciate it.
John, tell us a little bit about your background. You're the first archaeologist we've ever had on Dispatches. Tell us about yourself.
Thanks. I work at Juniata College as the director of the Cultural Resource Institute. I lead a pretty active fieldwork program where undergraduates get to come along and work on mainly battlefields and fortifications of the French and Indian War and Revolutionary War era here in Pennsylvania. I'm a local central Pennsylvania native, and the history is all around us here, not only prehistoric archaeology, but also historic archaeology. So it's sort of been in my blood ever since I was a freshman at college here at Juniata, and got interested in fieldwork and really never stopped doing it. I was trained as a prehistoric archaeologist doing rock shelter archaeology, but then I about 12 years ago started doing field work at the Fort Shirley site, running archaeological field school for Penn State there, where we discovered the 1755 fortification, and that sort of kicked off my career in battlefield and what's called conflict archaeology.
Jonathan, as you've mentioned, you've studied a lot of different eras of history, periods of history. You've been doing a lot of work. You found a very comfortable niche for yourself doing 18th century warfare, the 7 Years' War, the Revolution. The things you're finding, I can say, are extremely impressive in changing the way that we all think about these events. How did you get involved in the George Washington Friendly Fire Incident project?
Right. Well, I was as a field school instructor working at the Fort Shirley site, I began taking my students to Fort Ligonier so that they could envision a living history site, a reconstructed fortification, because we were looking for subsurface evidence of Fort Shirley. So that kicked off a really nice relationship between the staff at Fort Ligonier and our program here at Juniata College. We've been collaborating ever since, doing field schools. And then another opportunity popped up to work with veterans, and we organically created what's called the Veterans Archaeology Program with the support of Fort Ligonier as well. Not only investigating the October 12th attack, the Battle of Loyalhanna, a little bit around Fort Ligonier, but also then to search for, George Washington's Friendly Fire Incident, which occurred on November 12th, exactly 1 month after the Battle of Loyalhanna. The French and Native American raiding parties were at it again from Fort Duquesne. And that's what precipitated, the history. So working with private landowners and other historians and experts in the field, we've been, it's a process to kind of put this battlefield on the map.
John, for those on the site that aren't familiar with the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, in 1758, we see George Washington as a colonel in the Virginia militia, given a lot of responsibilities, really in a lot of ways for the first time. The Friendly Fire Incident is something that he didn't talk about for years because it will see the deaths of more than a dozen of his own Virginians, really a chaotic testament to the nature of war on the frontier. Could you tell us about quickly what that event was, how it transpired?
Sure. Like I said, 1 month to the day after the Battle of Loyalhanna, we have another French and Native American attempt to raid, not necessarily take the post at Loyalhanna, but to capture and kill as many cattle, force Forbes into winter quarters. This time in November, Colonel Mercer was fortunate enough to thwart this attack. It didn't make it all the way to Fort Ligonier, what we called Fort Ligonier. It was the post at Loyalhanna at the time. But what transpired was really kind of two battles that day, where George Mercer and his Virginia regiment, the Second Virginia Regiment, actually encountered this raiding party and sort of push them back and really take hold of the landform that they were using as a listening post to attack the fort. They made some very important prisoner captures that day. Um, what was heard back at the fort was a lot of shooting and commotion, right? George Washington was out there and valued as an officer because he knew Western Pennsylvania better than anyone. And he convinced or was asked by Forbes, ordered by Forbes to go out and assist Colonel Mercer with this route, essentially, or to help him if he needed help. Um, Washington allegedly took a different route. He didn't follow the Forbes Road to the scene of the battle, but rather used a tributary from Loyalhanna, sort of to approach the battlefield or the action area from a different direction, one that Colonel Mercer wasn't expecting, and essentially what precipitated was Mercer had done his job, pushed the French and the Native American attackers out of the area, captured three prisoners, were reconnoitering the landscape when George Washington arrives on the scene with the First Virginia Regiment. Again, from an area, from a direction that was kind of unbeknownst to Mercer. It was late in the day. It was November, so it was already dark, getting dark in the late afternoon. And what we have is a classic example of mistaken identity. Friendly fire broke out. And like you said, before they could really get a hold of the situation, there were a lot of dead and wounded.
So, whenever we look at the sources, Jonathan, about where this site happens, we don't get a lot of clues behind a mountain in front of a hill. That describes basically, the entirety of Western Pennsylvania. The Forbes Road is a great tool for historians and archaeologists in this regard, though, because it gives us a real footprint to work with. Could you talk about
Yeah.
what a resource the Forbes Road was for you?
Certainly. Um, when my attention was brought to this project, folks that were already aware of the Forbes Road location in that area, who hiked it in garb, right, in colonial garb, they were very confident that you could see the road both east and west of this location, right? So the Forbes Road, I knew it archaeologically from working at Fort Littleton and also at Fort Duart. So my expertise there allowed me to start recognizing this material culture, right? That's totally connected along these nodes or fortification um, stations. So the archaeology around and on the Forbes Road is very recognizable. It is littered with what we call strake nails, wagon parts, um, horseshoes, of course, and then any other incidentally lost items. So being able to recognize that and find it archaeologically gave us kind of an anchor point to say, okay, yes, we're in the right vicinity. Now, what looks different here as we get further away from the road, we actually saw evidence of a battle, right? Not incidentally lost artifacts, but shot balls, dropped balls, deformed musket balls, um, as well as evidence for campsite activity, because the French were using this location kind of as a safe spot, as a listening post, really, to harass the post at Loyalhanna. So there's other evidence there too that we found, not just of the road, not just of the battle, but also of the camping, the bivouac that was going on. And in addition to that, the Forbes expedition had lots of cattle and lots of horses, and their grass guards were out roving around looking for forage away from the fort. So this location would have been one of these prime kind of open meadow near a stream situation where it would have been open and good grazing too. So this area was probably known to both the French and the British forces that were there.
Jonathan, you use a lot of different tools in your work. One of them was that local tradition, even into the 21st century, amongst people who live in the area, in the modern area, had sort of a sense of where this might be, stories from their grandparents and great grandparents. What were some of those kind of oral traditions, and how, as an archaeologist, does that help you?
Right. As an archaeologist doing historical archaeology, as you might guess, a lot of the tools of the trade are also looking at deeds, looking at history, looking at oral histories, interviewing individuals who lived on the farm, maybe when they were children, and told information from their grandparents. So that reaches back over generations. Um, One of the things that has us sort of piqued our interest was that one of the landowners, previous landowners, was there as a little girl and being told by her grandparents, stay away from the springs. Don't drink water from these springs near this little marshy area because there are human burials there, right? That's not something you just kind of make up. There's usually some nugget of truth to that, even though few hundred years, 150 years might pass in between the telling of that information. So yes, archaeologists perk up when we hear things like that, because that's another independent line or supporting line of evidence as we try to understand what happened over 250 years ago at this location, looking for the material evidence. So Washington did write one thing about this incident, and it was later that evening when they made it back to the post. He wrote in his orderly book that on their way to attack Fort Duquesne the next day, they were sending a detachment of men with shovels to bury the dead from today's actions. So he definitely puts it in writing, doesn't say much about it, but we get a little bit of information, especially good information that they interred the individuals on site, right? So there's probably a mass grave or graves in the vicinity of that battlefield.
Yeah, Jonathan, as historians, we've looked for this site for a long time. And of course, we have maps, we have records, firsthand accounts. You have all those things as an archaeologist, but a whole panoply of other tools and gadgets we don't have. Ultimately, what made the difference in finding this site. Tell us about some of the cool technologies that you used here.
Okay. Well, primarily with the battlefield archaeology is done with metal detection technology, first of all. So we use metal detectors a lot, especially in our veterans archaeology program, coupled with a very accurate GPS system. So we can map these artifacts on the landscape. Um, a battlefield is a it's not a natural resource, it's a cultural resource, but it's a finite resource, right? And there have been people picking at this site over the decades that technology has been available. So a lot of the artifacts have been siphoned off, right? So we're dealing with a lot of the fragments and the pieces that were either not selected or not found or not located. So we want to throw as much technology and ability to sort of provide the concrete material evidence for battle action and the location in general. So some other technologies that we use are ground penetrating radar, geophysical techniques. Obviously, if you're in search of a disturbed feature like an interment, a grave, this is one of the technologies that works really well to locate cemeteries. Is ground penetrating radar. So we worked with geophysicists, and in fact, one of the geophysicists we work with is one of the nation's preeminent canine archaeological canine handlers as well. So what that means is he does survey with a dog who's trained to find archaeological human remains, which is a little bit different than just standard rescue dogs. Supposedly, the essence of human will hang around for hundreds of years, if not thousands in some cases. So these dogs can help narrow down an area if they are interested in a location and give the proper signals to their handlers. Then you can set up a grid and sort of do some ground penetrating radar that helps narrow the search. Other things we use are drones, LiDAR technology, anything that allows us to see the ground, the landscape, pick out the Forbes Road features. Those are all excellent technologies that we use in the field. And again, spatial technologies are are sort of how we build the case. The evidence has to hold up in a court of not law, but of historians and other archaeologists and scientists. So collecting the primary data and then applying other sorts of analyses. For instance, the lead is arguably the most important artifact class when looking for a battlefield. Um, Not only are we looking at the calibers of lead and the conditions of that lead, because it's very soft, it takes on all these neat characteristics and life history marks, but I've been working with a professor here at Juniata College who's a geologist specializing in lead isotopes in general. But Dr. Ryan Mather's a geochemist here and the head of the geology department. Conveniently, we are able to work together on artifacts that are made of copper, and in this case of lead, and really nail down some interesting information, almost a geochemical fingerprint of lead that we didn't really know before we started exploring this. So everything from the field to the laboratory, we can throw at this and build the case.
Yeah, this is a tough site, Jonathan, for us because it is private property. It hasn't been formally announced yet. There probably will be plans in the future to make this somewhat available as far as information. So we are limited. But let's talk about some of the things you found on site, right? You have these great tools. You mentioned lead. There's a whole story to be told here that's been under the ground for 250 years, right?
Right. Um, yeah, and like I said, we have pretty good evidence that there have been some very some folks who have been collecting from the site for a long time. We've actually gotten a look at some of the assemblage of artifacts, buckles, balls, buttons, the things that we typically associate with battlefield archaeology. Were taken off in copious amounts, and then we've got our mapped items, right? Um, so essentially, we've got to build this case that these pieces, every little piece or scrap that you can't necessarily ascribe to a culture because of the caliber, we want to still incorporate that in our analysis here, right? We want to be able to say, well, these little pieces are forensically indicative of the location, right? So we're not finding Civil War era lead or Mine balls, right? We're finding the right ammunition, the right shot, the right calibers, but then all that sprue and waste and other bits of materials that were dropped on the battlefield all of a sudden become vibrant data points and allow us to interpret this and see how much of the written record is corroborated here. And then how much can we add with archaeology? How much can archaeology add with respect to details of the battle and movement and locations?
Yeah, so we know that aside from the original battle, from the sources there, of course, there are going to be French soldiers on site before that.
Yeah.
And the research you found with your lead really reveals the complexity of the event, which I think gives a lot more weight to it. Could you talk about the story that the lead tells on this battlefield?
Sure. Um, the landscape in colonial America, the natural resource distribution, if you will, um, was such that New France had access to their own lead, right? They were already in Missouri and in Canada working these mines as early as 1720s, right? Becoming independent of European sources very early on, and then trading that, not only arming their own Marines with it, but also trading it to Native American groups. Um, that sets up, and then the colonies were being supplied by European mine sources, right? Being able to use lead isotopes to differentiate these sources, right? The European sources look different from the Missouri sources, look different from the local source that's here in Blair County, here in central Pennsylvania, where the mines at Fort Roberdeau were developed in an attempt to again create resource independence from Great Britain at the beginning of the American Revolution. But this isotope analysis shows us that that mine at Roberdeau was actually being exploited during the French and Indian War as well, because we have lead from Fort Shirley that has that same signature. But what this does is really opens up a larger understanding of supply chain, like where lead is being mined and how it's getting into the hands of people. But then also, this tool allows us to forensically peel the battlefield apart a little bit better. Not just there's a constellation of lead, but there's lead here. Some of it's from Missouri, some of it's from Canada, some of it is from Europe. And that again is another layer of independent evidence that we apply to the material that we're seeing.
Jonathan, as I mentioned at the top of the show, this is really the only George Washington battlefield that we have essentially lost. Where do you stand on the investigation? Is it finished? And how does it feel knowing that, when you're all said and done here, you have really given the country, I think, or reestablished a almost national treasure in a way by refinding this battlefield.
Right. It's an honor to work on this project. It's not a one-man show, obviously, with the support of Fort Ligonier, but also the painstaking hours that we put in with veterans. U.S. combat veterans come out and spend up to like 25 hours with us in the field, mapping and locating these items. We're all giddy when we find a piece of lead. We're all giddy when we find a button because we know that these are items that were very likely dropped by the Virginia Regiment, right? Not sometime in the past, but November 12th, 1758, and they're very significant. The fact that there are potentially human remains on site also gives the vets, that sense of not leaving folks in unmarked graves. Actually, if we could find this, and to answer your question, I believe we've found the site, but there's more work to be done. Right, there's more work to flesh out other parts of the battle action, as well as can we find any good evidence of these interments so that they could be memorialized. It's not like you would want to excavate or exhume them, but knowing where they are so that someone doesn't build a house on top of it in the future. Developing this site as kind of an interpretive, open air interpretive battlefield would be a very appropriate way to kind of put people back there in young George Washington's shoes, where he's seen as being human, right? Making some major tactical mistakes, essentially. The fact that he didn't have runners out there telling Mercer that they were going to be approaching from a different direction. They didn't have good intelligence dispersed. That kind of information is usable and teachable for the War College, essentially, for staff rides, for folks, young military leaders, to look at situations and understand them. This is one of those classic situations where we can use archaeology and history. They kind of come together, and we know more about what happened in the past because of it.
Jonathan, on this program, we're coming up on episode 300. We've asked this question at the end of every episode. Whenever you look at your research, at your findings, how do you think it helps us understand the revolutionary and pre-revolutionary era better?
Right. Well, like I said, all this material culture kind of hangs together. It's very recognizable and relatable. You can recognize buttons of the Pennsylvania provincial troops, when they're at these posts in 1756. You say, oh, these buttons look very similar, even though they weren't being supplied in mass with military supplies. Just putting these places on the map, once you know where the forts are, like Fort Shirley was unknown, the location was, roughly in the north end of Shirleysburg. Same with Halifax. Fort Halifax is now on the map. We're locating these. And once you've found them, you can preserve them. You can interpret them for the public and into the future. The other important thing I think that we're doing, especially with Dr. Mather and the isotope analysis, is adding, like I said, another line of evidence. Museums are full of musket balls, right? Lead balls. But now being able to say we could actually know where each one of those were mined, add more dimensionality to the archaeological record, and talk more to historians about, how to prove where a historic event occurred, even though it's not contained within a national park battlefield, that hasn't been located yet. But what does that look like, finding it, and how do you build the case? So, I'm very honored to be involved in this because I do think it's an important contribution.
Jonathan Burns, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Brady. My pleasure.